Well, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and in today's episode, I've invited an expert in probability on to discuss what skeptics online constantly, or consistently at least, get wrong about God and probability. So like I said, my name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and what I do on my channel is I expose you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. There's a lot of misunderstandings online about probability, even among Christians, not just skeptics or atheists. And so here's an example. When I present something like the fine-tuning argument online, a common objection that I get is that, well, we just don't know what the probability is because we've only observed one universe. So, and we're going to see in a moment what's sort of wrong with this objection and why it's important actually to correct this, because it happens a lot. And it's not just something that happens to skeptics or atheists, it happens to Christians as well. So it's important, I think, to get a better understanding of what probability is. And so that's why I invited an expert on. And let me go ahead and switch to my interview scene here. I've invited Dr. Nevin Climenhaga. Is that right?
Climenhaga, yeah.
Climenhaga, there you go. So I really appreciate you coming on. And actually, let me pop over to my live chat and make sure that, okay, it looks like everything's going good. Not seeing any issues there. All right, cool. So let me just tell you guys a little about Nevin. He's a research fellow in philosophy at Australian Catholic University. His research interests include epistemology, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, metaphysics, and ethics. He has published articles on Bayesian confirmation theory, causal inference, probability, explanation, the use of intuitions in philosophy, and the problem of evil. A lot of stuff. To find out more about him and his work, check the link in the description of this video. You can find his website and an article he wrote for Aeon. Is that how you say that? Aeon?
Yeah, Aeon magazine.
Yep, so just basically an introduction to understanding some different interpretations of probability, and we're going to go over some of those today, actually. Well, if you want to learn new, exciting things about apologetics and see intelligent conversations between Christians and non-Christians, make sure to subscribe to my channel, turn on a little bell so you can get notifications when I post new videos. Before we get into the interview, this is just a quick reminder that I support my family, my wife, and 2 kids through this ministry, so if you find value in the work that I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Patreon.com/capturingchristianity is the way to do that. You can also actually gain access to a Facebook group that we have called the Bereans. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can gain access to a private Facebook group where we post a whole bunch of different things. One of the things that we were actually talking about earlier was the fact that I added this little guitar into my background here. And that is not just a prop. It's actually, I do play guitar. I played guitar for quite a while, since I was 14. I'm 32 now, so a long time. And I played guitar at my church a long time ago. Actually, I was playing my guitar when my wife came and I met my wife at my church. Anyways, so I do play guitar. That's the whole point, is that it's not just a prop. I'm not just trying to like look cool. It is actually, it was fun actually to pull it out because I haven't played in a while, so that was cool. All right, well, let's get into the interview. Oh, sorry, one last thing. So this video was actually sponsored by Software Development Pty Limited. They're a company that brings people's software ideas to life. So if you would like to sponsor one of my future videos, the way to do that, the way to get in contact with me is actually at the bottom in the description of this video. So you can contact me there if you'd like to sponsor one of my future videos. So really appreciate it. All right, let's get into the interview. So the first question is, what is like the number one misconception about probability that you've seen online?
All right. Well, so first, thank you for having me, Cameron. I'm excited to be speaking to you about probability. So you asked what the number one misconception about probability online is, do I think? And as you know, in a lot of popular discussions about probability, people will make very confident claims about what probability is or how it can be applied. So they'll say, for example, that the probability of any past event is 1. Or they'll say that only repeatable events have probabilities. So we can talk about the probability of the coin landing heads or of drawing a black marble from a bag, but not about the probability of creating a universe. And you want to talk about some of these ideas later in this interview. So I'm a bit hesitant to call these misconceptions because there are arguments one could give for these positions. Instead, I think what I would say is that the biggest misconception is that these kinds of claims can just be asserted without argument, or that they're obvious, or that they fall out of some unproblematic technical definition of probability. So in fact, the definition of probability is disputed, and it's a difficult philosophical question. So if you open a mathematics textbook or a statistics or physics or philosophy textbook, you'll find that they say different things about probability and that they're not consistent with each other in what they say. So if you have a definition or an analysis of probability out of which falls, some interesting claim about what they are, how they can be applied, well, you need to argue for that analysis and explain why you think it's superior to rival conceptions of probability.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to make, is that a lot of times in these conversations, it's just sort of assumed that, well, my understanding of probability is automatically correct because that's how it seems intuitively obvious to me. So I think that's important to point out, is that it's not, you can't really do that. When you're doing philosophy, you got to slow down and be like, okay, well, this is a claim that I'm making, and we can analyze that. We can ask, well, what's the assumption that's happening here? And the assumption is that you're actually using a certain interpretation of probability. It is a good time to maybe get into that. So what are some of the, in the literature and in academia, what are some of the most common interpretations of probability?
Yeah, so I think what you say about philosophy is exactly right. What we try to do as philosophers is to break things down into their most fundamental components, to ask as many questions as we can about what it is that we're trying to understand. And so that involves, going pretty deep and thinking very carefully about things, questioning a lot of assumptions. In terms of probability, then, there are a lot of interpretations out there, and there's no universally agreed upon typology of different views. So I want to talk about three popular views. Yeah, go ahead.
I should mention real quickly. So in the description of this video, and you were actually the one that suggested I put this in there, I've included the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the little article on interpretations of probability in the description of this video. So if you want to get a little bit more beyond what Nevin is just about to explain, check that link, right? It's a great resource.
Yeah, that's right. That's a very good article that introduces different interpretations of probability. It talks about some that I won't talk about today. My Aeon article also goes over the three interpretations that I will talk about today, and that's an even shorter, gentler introduction. But those are both good places to start. So,
cool.
one thing I want to say before going into the three interpretations, one view that I also want to briefly mention is a view that kind of rejects the question in a way that says that there's not really a problem of providing an interpretation. So this is the view that the definition of probability is just given by the mathematical axioms of probability.
So explain that for me.
Yeah, so these are Kolmogorov's axioms. That's the name of the mathematician who came up with them in the 1930s. And they give the generally agreed upon rules for how probabilities work mathematically. So, for example, they imply that the probability of A and the probability of not A have to sum to 1.
Okay.
So, and I won't go over all the axioms here. It's not important for our purposes. But the view that I have in mind here is one that says that anything which obeys the mathematical axioms is probability, that it's just a mathematical notion. Okay. So degrees of confidence could be probabilities, frequencies could be probabilities, and so on. Anything which obeys the mathematics. This is, I think, the most popular view among mathematicians. It's also a popular view among some philosophers who kind of want to dissolve the debate, as I said, about the interpretation of probabilities. I myself don't think that this view can be right, because some things that obey the mathematical rules of probability are not probabilities in any pre-theoretic sense of the term. So let me explain what I mean by that. So I've drawn on the board behind me here an example of this. So here we have normalized areas. When I say that they're normalized, what that means is that the areas are divided by some constant so that they sum up to 1 in total. So I've drawn up on the whiteboard a square and written that it has area 1. And then I've drawn 2 rectangles inside it, labeled them A and B. A has area 3/4 and B has area 1/4. So they sum to 1. And in fact, all the areas in this very simple diagram obey the axioms of probability. And that's because the mathematics of probability and of proportion are interchangeable. Mathematically, they're just the same. So now suppose that I said to you, A is bigger than B, so probably A. Well, you'd probably reply, well, what do you mean? Probably A. What do you mean by that? I say, I mean, the probability of rectangle A is high, 3/4 to be precise. Well, here, it sounds like I'm confused in some way. I'm making some kind of category error. What I'm saying could make sense if I was using these areas to represent something else. So, like, maybe I'm using A to represent the proposition that it rains tomorrow, and the area of A corresponds to the probability of rain. But if I'm not doing that, well, then it doesn't make sense. It doesn't track our ordinary understanding of probability to say that A itself, that rectangle on the board, literally has a probability. That's a category mistake.
So this first well, I guess you're not giving an interpretation of probability right now, or I guess you kind of are. You're saying that there's this one, the most common interpretation among mathematicians is that anything that obeys basically the axioms of math is going to be probability. And what you're saying is that, well, here's a pretty clear counterexample. This A and B on the board doesn't make sense unless we basically specify what A and B are. But let me just, if you're just joining us, so we're talking about probability in God and how understanding probability, what it is going to help answer a lot of objections and misunderstandings, misconceptions, or just false claims about probability in the context of theistic arguments, God's existence, something like the fine-tuning argument. So that's what we're doing today. And the reason why we're starting off this way and talking about probability so deeply is because it's going to clear up a lot of stuff. And it's actually going to be very insightful, I think, once we get through these common interpretations of probability. It's going to make a lot of things clear that might not have been clear before, because there's a lot of stuff going on beneath the surface that we need a philosopher sometimes to help us parse out what's really happening here. So I just wanted to make that clarification, what we're doing here, why we're doing all of this, and getting so deep so quickly into probability. But continue.
Yeah, these questions about probability are ones that come up very generally in philosophy, and not just in philosophy, in physics and statistics and mathematics and psychology, and any area in which people talk about probabilities, which is really most of the sciences. And so it's a very general question and has applications not just to philosophy of religion, but to a lot of things. So the interpretation or rejection of an interpretation that I've just been talking about is one in which anything that obeys the mathematics of probability is probability, that it's just a mathematical notion. And the problem with that, as my example here is supposed to bring out, is that probability is not just a technical mathematical notion. It's a pre-theoretic concept. It's one that's already present in a lot of ordinary thought and language. And so I think actually this relates to the common misconception that you asked me about earlier. People often don't realize that probability isn't just a technical concept that has some stipulated definition, but rather different definitions are better and worse attempts to capture a pre-theoretic idea. So probability and associated terms like probably, likely, and so on, those terms existed before the mathematical axioms existed. They're still used by many people unfamiliar with those axioms. And we can ask of any particular mathematical formalization or philosophical analysis whether it does a good job of formalizing that pre-theoretic concept. And this is more or less...
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. This is more or less the same thing that we do when philosophers try to analyze any concept, like knowledge. So we start with...
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, exactly. We start with like pre-theoretic intuitions, and then we ask what theory best captures those intuitions.
Yeah. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. So let's get into the different interpretations then, some of the more common ones, because you actually reject the common understandings or analyses.
That's right, yeah.
Of probability.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about three interpretations that are probably the most popular ones, and then I'm going to talk about my own interpretation after that. So here it's useful to start with a few ordinary examples of sentences in which we use probability language to get an idea of what concept we're trying to capture. So here are a few examples. There's a 50% chance that the coin will land heads. Given the scientific evidence, it's highly probable that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid. It's more likely that the butler's fingerprints would be on the gun if he's the murderer than otherwise. So those are some examples. When we look at proposed interpretations of probability, we then want to see how well they can handle these and other examples. So let me now talk about some popular views and how they fare with those examples. The first popular interpretation is frequentism. According to frequentism, the probability of A is the frequency with which A occurs or A is true in some reference class. So for example, when I say that the probability that the coin lands heads is 50%, what I mean is that when we toss this coin, it lands heads 50% of the time. Frequentism is a popular interpretation of probability among non-philosophers, but it's not very popular among contemporary philosophers. At first glance, it seems to do okay on the coin tossing example, although there are serious problems about how to understand it even there. Like, are we talking about all actual tosses of the coin, counterfactual tosses of the coin? If counterfactual, how defined, which counterfactual ones? Even if we set that aside, though, it doesn't seem to do so well in other examples. So take my second statement on the asteroid strike. Given the scientific evidence, it's highly probable that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid strike. Well, the dinosaur extinction is a one-off event. It's only happened once, and it can only happen once. So it's not like 90% of dinosaur extinctions are caused by asteroid strikes. Either 100% are or 0% are. Now, you might try to search around for some other reference class, like maybe all mass extinctions on Earth. That won't work either, though, because at least right now, we think that most of the mass extinctions on Earth, I think there have been around 5 or 6, were not caused by asteroid strikes, but were caused by other factors like climate change. So the dinosaur extinction, if it was caused by an asteroid strike, is unique in that respect. And we think it was caused by an asteroid strike not because we put it in some reference class, like the reference class of all mass extinction events, and say that the majority of those were caused by asteroid strikes, but rather because we have particular evidence for it being caused by an asteroid strike. Like, we have other evidence that there was an asteroid strike at that time. There are features of the extinction, like it being global and rapid, that are best explained by an asteroid strike, and so on. So it's pretty hard to understand what we mean when we say it's highly probable that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid on frequentism.
So let me just jump in real quickly right here. And what I want to do is just get some clarity on some of the terminology you used. Mm-hmm. I think really the only thing that we might need help with is reference class. So what is a reference class and how does that apply here? Right, good. So it's something like a group of individuals or propositions or whatever you think the relata, the things that we're talking, the things that have probabilities are. So if you think that the probability of A is like the frequency with which A is true in some reference class, the idea is that we have a bunch of repeated trials, like we flip a coin, say 100 times, and then we have the proposition, the coin lands heads, and the coin is flipped. And so, given that the coin is flipped, we have 100 instances where that proposition is true. That's our reference class. So reference class is just whatever it is that we're trying to think about probabilistically. So if we're thinking about a coin, the probability of a coin toss, coins would be our reference class, right? Well, or would it be something different? It's a little bit tricky. So coins could be the reference class, or it could be all tosses of this coin. It could be all tosses of any coin. It could be all tosses. It sounds like you're raising the problem of the reference class. Yeah, exactly. Problem. Yeah, the problem of the reference class. So this is why it's a little bit tricky to say exactly. So, excuse me. So the reference class is supposed to be something that we evaluate probabilities with respect to. It's like a group of events or instances where a proposition is true, and then we want to look what frequency within that reference class is this other proposition that we're interested in, like the coin lands heads. Is that true in? What proportion of all of these total instances is that true in? But as we just saw, that it's hard to say exactly what that reference class is concretely in a particular case. So are we talking about all instances in which this coin is tossed? Are we talking about all instances in which any coin is tossed? Are we talking about all instances in which this coin could be tossed? Are we talking about something counterfactual? And as you say, that's known as the reference class problem, specifying what the relevant reference class is for frequentism. Gotcha. So that was the first one. I think we're relatively clear on that one. And one of your points was that this doesn't capture our pre-theoretic, not intuitions, but our pre-theoretic, what was the term there that you used?
The way that we use probability language.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, so it doesn't capture fully the way that we use probability language because, and you gave the example of, what was it, the dinosaurs, right? The mass extinction, because that event was either a one-off, it was like either it happened or it didn't.
Yeah.
So we can't use this like frequency interpretation in order to say that this thing happened at a high degree of certainty.
Right.
Whatever you want to say. Yeah.
And
So we have a counterexample to that.
And then I suggested like a way you might go, which is to say, oh, well, there's some other reference class. So that's the reference class problem, right? Like this first reference class doesn't work. Well, maybe it's all mass extinction events. And then I suggested why it doesn't seem like that will work. And that's going to be a general problem for frequentism for analyzing a lot of probability statements.
Right. And I think it's important to camp out here for a second because, like you mentioned, this is sort of the interpretation of probability that sort of gets assumed by not just mathematicians. I think that's who we were talking about. But I think it's the interpretation of probability that people assume just almost across the board.
Yeah.
But what's weird about it is that it's, for some instances, it's okay. Like people use frequencies to get some sort of sense of what a probability is. But in other instances, they don't use frequencies at all. And so it's almost, I don't know, it's sort of a weird situation. But I do know that people do sort of assume frequentism, especially when we're talking about arguments for God's existence in the beginning of the universe and fine tuning, for example. A lot of people say we've only observed one universe, so we haven't done any repeated trials, so to speak. And so I think it's important to camp out here and point out that there are really well-known problems with this interpretation of probability. And so you can't just sort of assume that this is how probability is. I think that's just the wrong way to go. Anyways, any other thoughts on frequentism before we move on to the second popular interpretation?
Just briefly. So I haven't done any surveys or anything, but I don't think that this is the most popular interpretation among mathematicians or among pure mathematicians. They I think would tend to have the kind of rejection of the problem that I mentioned, where it's just a mathematical concept, anything that obeys the mathematics. I think frequentism might be the most common view among statisticians. And often, if you read like an applied mathematics textbook or areas which use statistics like the social sciences, then they might assume frequentism or state a view that looks very close to frequentism.
All right. Well, let's move on to the next one.
Yeah. So a second popular interpretation is the propensity interpretation. So on this interpretation, the probability of an event is the intrinsic propensity or tendency that event has to occur. So if a coin is fair, so that nothing in the system in which it's being tossed inclines it towards heads or tails, then it has a 50% propensity to land heads. So this is, on this analysis, what I mean when I say the chance of this coin landing heads is 50%.
It sounds like you're almost saying, like all things being equal, there's a 50% chance.
Well, that kind of gets to my own analysis later, which says the probabilities are relative to what it is that we're conditioning on. So my own view is forecasting a little bit. My own view is that when we make these kinds of propensity statements, what we're saying is, given all the causally antecedent information, the probability is 50% or whatever it is. On the propensity view, though, that's all probability statements. They're all about the propensity that some event has to occur given the characteristics of the system.
Okay. Yeah. So what else do we need to know about this view?
Yeah. So again, this interpretation is popular among some non-philosophers, and I think this interpretation is behind the common idea that the probability of any past event is 1, which is, again, a thing that you'll hear some people say. The idea is that once an event has occurred, it no longer has any propensity to not occur. Again, though, this interpretation seems to not do a good job of capturing all our examples. So again, the second statement, the probability that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid is very high. Well, that probability is not the same as the propensity that the dinosaurs have to be killed by an asteroid. So first, this is a past event. So if we accept what I just said a moment ago, that the propensity of any past event is 1, then its propensity to occur is 1, assuming that it did occur. But even if we looked at the past propensity, that the dinosaurs had to be killed by an asteroid, well, that doesn't look right either. That's not the probability that we're after. So imagine that the asteroid that, in fact, did kill the dinosaurs was extremely unlikely to do so. It was, just a minor deviation on its path, and it wouldn't have hit the Earth. It would have flown past. Well, then the propensity that it had to kill the dinosaurs was low, but that's compatible with the probability of this event having occurred being high given our evidence. Because we have a lot of information after the fact that is evidence for this event that supports that it occurred. So even if antecedently we think that the probability that it would occur is low, that doesn't mean that the probability that it did occur, given all our evidence, is not high. And this seems like a case in which, in fact, that probability is high.
I'm going to be honest, this interpretation is just very difficult to wrap my mind around. But it sounds like what the problem that you're raising here is like when we're talking about an event that happened in time, then it's difficult. Like we have one propensity. Well, I mean, we could give a more mundane example. So the propensity that if I rolled a 6-sided die, the propensity for it to land on 1 would be 1 out of 6. But then suppose I went ahead and rolled the dice and then it came up a 2. And so the propensity on this view that it rolled a 2 would be 100%, right? Because that's the propensity.
Yeah.
But it seems weird to say that the propensity changes depending on what time you're at. Is that sort of where?
Well, that's one problem in that if you take the view to imply that past events all have probability 1, sometimes past events can have probability less than 1 relative to our evidence, and so it doesn't seem to capture the right thing there. But that wasn't the only problem. So
I think that's a different problem than what I'm raising.
Oh, okay.
So I think what you're saying is that in our ordinary language of probability, when we're talking about a past event, we don't think that it's 100%.
Yeah.
We think that there's like a 90% chance or however much.
Right.
You know. So that's one thing to say.
Yeah.
The second thing, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
Oh, so I just wanted to say that with this interpretation, as with any of these interpretations, there are different ways to fill them out. So it's not like there's, as I said, it's not like there's some agreed upon typology where, you have these 4 views and, you pick one of those and that's the end of the story. You can give a different way of fleshing out the kind of basic idea of any of these interpretations. Like if you're a frequentist, you can give a different account of what the relevant reference class is. If you're a propensity theorist, you can say that propensities of past events are all 1, or you can say, no, propensities don't change. It's a timeless thing that refers to, the tendency that the event had to occur when it occurred or when it could have occurred. I don't think either of those ways of filling out the propensity view works. And that's what I was suggesting with the dinosaur example, that if you say the probability that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid, given our evidence, well, that's the propensity that event had to occur. I think there are problems with that too.
It almost sounds like a tautology. It sounds like you're just using propensity to say probability. I don't know.
Well, that's kind of a general problem with any of these analyses, is that there's going to be a question, not any of them, but with some of them, including my own, they might not be reductive analyses in that they might not analyze probability in terms of something that we independently have a grip on. Instead, they might be kind of ways of clarifying probability or talking about it in different language that might help us understand it better without reducing it to something that is not already part of our idea of probability, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to the third one, unless you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, I think we can move on. So the third interpretation is the degree of belief or degree of confidence interpretation. On this interpretation, when I say, for example, the probability that this coin will land heads is 50%, what I mean is that I'm 50% confident that it will land heads. This interpretation is popular among many philosophers. It's not, I think, as popular among lay people, but it's probably, at least historically, the most popular, the most important among philosophers. I also think this interpretation doesn't work. It faces a somewhat different problem from the earlier ones. So certainly we can imagine cases where my degree of confidence matches the probability of heads or of the dinosaurs having been killed by an asteroid in the examples I gave. But we can also imagine cases where these things come apart. If I'm irrational, if I have irrational degrees of confidence. So suppose that I say the probability that this coin lands heads is 70%. But I don't have any special evidence that it will land heads. I'm just unreasonably biased towards heads. Or suppose I say that the probability that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid is very low. But I don't think this because my evidence suggests this. Instead, I think this because I've made a career out of promoting an alternative explanation of the dinosaur extinction. And even though the evidence has come in and it really doesn't support my explanation, I don't want to admit that I'm likely wrong. In these cases, it seems like when I say this probability is 70% or this probability is very low, it seems like I'm wrong. I say something that's false. But on the degree of confidence interpretation, if I've truly reported how confident I am, then I'm not wrong. And that seems like the wrong result. So it looks like this interpretation doesn't get the right result in all cases either.
Is this another word for this interpretation of probability, epistemic probability?
Epistemic probability is ambiguous, or it can mean different things. So some people would call that an epistemic interpretation of probability, in that it has to do with your beliefs. Some people will also talk about epistemic probability to mean something more objective, and that includes me. I have used the term epistemic probability in my work, and I don't mean degree of belief by it. But again, as I said, there's no universally agreed upon typology or way of using these terms. So I use the phrase degree of belief interpretation or degree of confidence interpretation. And that's my preferred name for this view.
That's helpful. Okay, so those are the three different views, and so you've given some responses to them as well, and some potential counterexamples how they don't line up with the way that we ordinarily use the language of probability.
Yeah.
So then, what is your preferred view of probability?
So my own view is what I call a degree of support interpretation. The idea here is that the probability of A given B is the degree to which A supports B. So let's go back to my three statements. The first one was the chance of heads is 50%, but the other two both talked about the probability of one thing given another thing. The probability that the dinosaur extinction was caused by an asteroid given the scientific evidence, or the probability that the Butler's fingerprints would be on the gun given that he's the killer, or given that he's not. Now, my view is that all probabilities are implicitly conditional in this way. Well, some of them are explicitly conditional, like the ones I just said, but some of them are implicitly conditional. And that in any case, we're talking about the degree to which one proposition supports another. So
and by conditional, you just mean that the probability of A given B.
Yeah, that's right.
So if A, then B.
Yeah, right. So you can think of it as kind of, right, as like a conditional statement, right? If A, then B, but not with certainty, only with some probability. So the probability of B given A. The degree to which, so my view is that's the degree to which A supports B. So
Gotcha.
to go...
And so what...
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, how does this avoid some of the problems that you had? Well, I guess you've already sort of explained that it works with all three of these.
Yeah.
The ordinary way that we use language.
So let me just spell out the examples that I gave, and then I can come back to that question. So with the last statement about the Butler, there the idea is, my last statement, it's more likely that the Butler's fingerprints would be on the gun if he's the murderer than otherwise. What that means is that the hypothesis that the Butler is the murderer more strongly supports his fingerprints being on the gun than does the hypothesis that someone else is the murderer. With the asteroid strike example, that's pretty straightforward. I'm saying the current scientific evidence supports the hypothesis that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid to a high degree. Then where this interpretation has to do a little bit more work is in cases where we don't explicitly make a conditional statement, like the coin example. So there, I said the chance that the coin will land heads is 50%. And what I would say is that what I mean by that in an ordinary context is something like, given all causally antecedent facts, or maybe given all macro level causally antecedent facts, the probability that the coin lands heads is 50%. So there's some implicit background, but that background could change, like if I had different evidence. So suppose that we flip the coin already, but I was blindfolded, so I didn't see the result. And then you flip it 3 more times, and you tell me 3/4 of the flips of this coin landed heads. Then I would say, oh, or I might say, oh, so the probability that the first flip landed heads is 75%. Well, there, I didn't say the probability given anything, but plausibly what I mean is the probability given the evidence that you've just given me about the frequency with which the coin landed heads in those 4 tosses. Given that, the probability is 75%. So that's an example where I might make the same statement. The probability that the coin lands heads is X, but it's relative to different evidence.
So it sounds like what you're doing. Yes, it sounds like what you're doing is in the problematic cases, then you're basically saying that there's something implicit going on behind the scenes, so to speak, where you're sort of assuming that in the case of a coin toss, when you're about to flip the coin, you're already taking into account everything up until that point, and all of your information up until that point is consistent with you flipping heads or tails, basically.
Right, yeah.
But when you use the language of it's a 50% probability that I'm going to flip heads when I flip this coin, that language is sort of implicitly assuming all the antecedent or the previous evidence that we already have.
Yeah, that's right. And so in different contexts, then a different background, a different condition could be assumed. And so if it's before I flip the coin, then I might be assuming any relevant causally antecedent facts. If it's afterwards, when I haven't seen the result, but you've told me some information about this and other coin flips, then it might be relative to that further information as well. Or I'm sorry, relative to that further information.
Let's move on to, so one of the things that I think someone might be thinking about right now as they're watching this is, doesn't this all seem a bit much? Like this entire thing that we've just done for 30 minutes or however long is just completely unnecessary. Like we just sort of know that when I'm about to roll a pair of dice, the probability that the 2 dice sum up to 3 is 1 in 12. Like why do we have to go through this whole rigmarole? I don't know where that came from. Why do we have to go through this whole thing of trying to analyze probability? Why can't we sort of intuitively know what probability is?
So first, I think that probability is 1 in 18, not 1 in 12.
Oh, so, I was saying a pair of dice.
Yeah. So it's 136 plus 136. That's the 2 ways of getting that result.
So what I was thinking, oh, okay, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So it's not so easy, even in these fairly simple cases, right? But more generally, that's not really relevant to the general question. The general response I would make is that even if some probabilities are easy, even if it's easy to say what the answer to a question about probability is in some very simple examples, in more complicated cases, people disagree. And the answers are not obvious. And then we need to do some careful philosophical work to clarify what it is that we're talking about. So, for example, often in ordinary language, the relevant background context is not clear, like what it is that this probability is relative to. That might not be made clear. And so we have to specify that before we can answer the question about the probability. And so you need to do some philosophical work in these harder cases before you can come to agreement or before you can figure out the answers to the questions that you're interested in.
All right, so now that we've done all of this groundwork and looking at probability way more in detail, how does your view interact with some of these objections that we see from skeptics? And even it's not just skeptics. Again, it's not skeptics aren't the only people that sort of have these inconsistent views of probability or assume some sort of interpretation that has problems. But let's take a concrete example. So one of the things that I see when I'm talking about the fine-tuning argument is this idea that we can't really know what the probability is of a life-permitting universe because we've only observed a life-permitting universe. And so either the probability is 1 out of 1 or we don't know because we don't know what other kind of universes are possible. So how does your view interact with this objection?
Right. And so this is an example, I think, that is relevant to your question just a minute ago. So this is a case where this is controversial, right? How do you think about the probability So we need to be clear about what we think probability is before we can think about how it applies or how to apply it in this specific example. So I think your statement of the objection, which is maybe consistent with how people often raise this kind of objection, could be read in a couple of different ways. So one way of reading the objection is that there just is no probability here, or that the probability is 1 or 0. So this is an objection about what the probability actually is, not about our knowledge of it. And this view might fall out of frequentist interpretation, for example. So if you think that probabilities are frequencies, then you might think the probability that the universe is life permitting is just 1, because there only is one universe and it's life permitting. So the reference class here is just this one universe and it's life permitting. So the probability is 1. All right. And the relevance of what I've said earlier to that is that this falls out just out of one interpretation of probability, but it's not necessarily going to fall out of other interpretations of probability. On other interpretations, that probability might be something non-extreme, something between 0 and 1. The second way of taking the objection is having to do with our knowledge of probabilities. Like, how can we come to know this? And again, what you say there is going to depend on your view about the interpretation of probability. So my own view, just to get that into how my own view applies to this, on both those questions, my own view suggests that there is a well-defined probability here, and that it's, at least in principle, something that we can know. If we think about other probabilities that might be relevant to it and do the philosophical work of reasoning about it, breaking it down into other probabilities as those are relevant. So the probability we're interested in here is the probability of a life-permitting universe given naturalism. What's the probability that the universe would be life-permitting given naturalism? So it's this conditional thing. As I've said, we're looking, on my view, at how strongly does the hypothesis of naturalism support the proposition that this universe is life-permitting. Now, there's going to be some trickiness there, like how do we define naturalism and so on. So to simplify things, let's say that we're just talking about single universe naturalism. So we're not talking about a hypothesis on which a multiverse is possible, because that will make things more complicated. If we're just talking about the probability that the universe is life-permitting on single universe naturalism, then the idea would be that single universe naturalism antecedently gives no reason to expect that any of the mathematically possible universes would be the actual universe as opposed to any of the others. So if you do the kind of thing that theoretical physicists do, where they look at what are different ways of specifying the constants of the laws of nature and the initial conditions and so on, and what results from that, then what they say is that in the vast majority of those different possible universes that we get, when we specify those variables, that universe is not life-permitting. And given naturalism, given single universe naturalism, rather, there's no reason to expect that the universe would be one of those ways rather than the other. That hypothesis doesn't support the universe having these particular constants or these other particular constants. And so, if the proportion of possible universes that allows for life is very low, then the probability that the universe will allow for life, given single universe naturalism, given this hypothesis, which doesn't give any reason to expect one of these universes over another, well, that will also be very low.
Well, let's go on to another objection. This is very related because I see this a lot too. And you just mentioned, well, of the possible of the universes that are possible, single universe naturalism doesn't predict any single one of those with any strong degree of certainty. So one objection that I see a lot, though, is, well, how do we know that these other universes are really possible? So how does that view interact, or how does that objection interact with your view?
Right. And so, again, I think the question is going to be, to what degree does naturalism or single universe naturalism support the hypothesis that these other universes are impossible, or that any particular universe is impossible? Just like probability, possibility is a contested notion that could be understood in different ways. there are going to be tricky issues, and I want to acknowledge that, about how to understand the probability of propositions that are impossible in some sense of impossible. So the standard axioms of probability will imply that the probability of necessary truths, and again, how you understand necessary here is going to depend on exactly how you understand the axioms, but the probability of necessary truths is going to be 1, and the probability of impossibilities is going to be 0. But in spite of that, it seems like we do naturally talk about non-extreme probabilities of necessary truths and falsehoods. So in mathematics, for example, we can speculate some hypothesis about the natural numbers and then look at a bunch of instances of that and find that they hold up to 1 billion. And then say, oh, so that's good evidence that this hypothesis is true. And it seems like we're doing something that is more or less the same thing that we do when we use probabilities to reason empirically. Or, suppose that you don't have any information about what the millionth digit of pi is. Well, it seems that relative to your information, the probability that it's 9 is 1 in 10. And so those kinds of things suggest there is some way of understanding probability as applying even to necessary truths and falsehoods. So let's suppose then that it might be right that other universes are not possible. Well, if what I've just said is right, then there is some way of reasoning probabilistically about that kind of scenario, about the probability of these other universes, even if it's epistemically possible that they are, let's say, metaphysically impossible. And so even if it's difficult to formalize that exactly, it seems like this is something that we can do in other contexts. Then the question becomes how much does the hypothesis of single universe naturalism support the proposition that these other universes are impossible? And just on its own, it doesn't look to me like we have reason to think that it does support that hypothesis. Now, it might be that that's something that we would reevaluate our view on if, in a future physics, somebody came up with like a unification of things that currently seem like independent variables and said, oh, actually, there's some deeper physics that shows that these other things are impossible, or that at least some of the universes we thought were possible are impossible. But at least relative to what we currently know, we don't have reason to think that that's the case. And so relative to what we currently know, it's not more likely that any of the universes that are, as far as we can tell, mathematically consistent are impossible than that any others are. And so then when we find, oh, the universe is life permitting, or this is the universe that we have, this particular one, well, that's just as surprising, given naturalism, as any of the other universes. And so the probability is still very low. So it looks to me like unless we have some independent reason to expect that these other non-life permitting universes are impossible on naturalism, then that doesn't change how probable naturalism makes our universe being life permitting.
I think one of the things that you pointed out, which was really profound, was the fact that even if it's metaphysically necessary that our universe be life permitting, it doesn't follow that we can't use or talk about probability in that way. And here's maybe an example to help with this idea, is that suppose that, well, first let's just suppose that it is metaphysically necessary that our universe or any universe has to be life permitting.
Yeah.
Still, suppose that one day we all looked up at the moon and we saw that an asteroid shower hit the moon and wrote out a note saying Dr. Climenhaga was going to be on Capturing Christianity talking about probability and also God exists. That was the message that was written on the moon in asteroids, okay?
Yeah.
Even if our universe was the only metaphysically possible universe, it still seems like we have a lot of good evidence that naturalism is false.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that we can do is to look at the implications that a particular principle would have in other cases. And I think that's a nice example. Robin Collins gives that kind of example. A number of people have given those kinds of examples when talking about the fine-tuning argument. If some principle would show that what looks like something that looks like it would be very good evidence for theism is in fact completely irrelevant to it, well then
Hey, Nevin, it looks like you might have cut out real quick for a second. Sorry, guys. It's saying that there's a poor network connection, so I'm waiting for him to come back here. I might try to call him back in a second. There we go. Try to call him back and get him back on the show as quickly as possible. I've got it ringing in my ears now, so it's difficult to try to pay attention to what's going on. Well, while I'm trying to get him back, what I want to do is I think he'll probably call me in just a second. We're about to actually switch to Q&A. So assuming that I can get Nevin back on the line here, I'm going to pop up back over to YouTube live chat and make sure everyone can still hear me. Okay, it looks like... all right, yeah, it looks like he needs someone said he needs a new internet connection. Well, I hope you guys can still see me. It looks like everything is still streaming perfectly, so let me know if you guys can see. So what I was going to say is that we are about to switch to live Q&A, and we'll see if I can get Nevin back. And so what you can do right now, as we're waiting, is go ahead and type in the... Let me make my screen full screen here, since we're trying to get him back here. If you have a question, type it in the live chat. Make sure to ask or at Capturing Christianity. That way I can make sure to see it, although there's not a whole lot that we can do here. So someone says that I'm actually really fuzzy. Okay. I'm not really sure what that means because I can't see anything that looks fuzzy. Okay, he's so Nevin just texted me. He says he's trying to reconnect his computer. Okay. So it might look fuzzy because I have the latency on low latency, and so I think that's sort of what's happening there. If it looks a little fuzzy, so it says that he's trying to get his computer back. But so all right, well let's go back to questions because it looks like I am going to get Nevin back here in just a second. So if you have a question, make sure to write it in the live chat. Doesn't look like we have any so far, but you can also let me know what you've thought so far of this interview, even though we're having just a little technical difficulties so far, or right now. This is a really, really important topic, probability, because there's a lot of misunderstandings of this online, and this is going to be very relevant to the stream that we're doing on Thursday. This is part of the reason why I wanted to schedule this first before we do the stream on Thursday, where I respond to apologia, however you say that, on my puddle analogy video. Getting a good understanding of probability is going to be very important when we're discussing who's got the right side of probability here. So again, if you have a question, leave it in the live chat. And until then, let me actually pull him up here and see if I can call him back. So it looks like we do have one question from somebody, but make sure to tag at Capturing Christianity. All right, it looks like we're still having difficulties on his end. We'll keep going. Ask your questions in the live chat. I'm not the philosopher here that's got a PhD in thinking about probability, but I can still take your questions and hopefully we can get him back and on the line. Where do I go from here? I hadn't planned to do this, guys. I mean, you can ask me a different question in the meantime, something unrelated to a technical understanding of probability. I can let you guys know sort of some things that I'm working on in the background in the meantime. So we filmed a round of interviews, in-person interviews in Brooklyn back in the beginning of August. And okay, it looks like he is trying to call me. There we go. All right, looks like I might have him back. All right, looks like you're back.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I think the internet at my work here is not working, so I've tethered to my phone now, and that is working.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. All right. Well, I've just been essentially filibustering until we've gotten to this point. If you'd like to pick up where you were, I don't remember, or I don't know if you remember where you were, but we are having some questions sort of pile in here. So it's up to
Okay.
you. We can look at questions, or you can try to finish out your point that you were making.
I know I had more to say. Can you remind me what the last thing was before we cut
Yeah.
out?
Well, I just made the point that in turn, like we can still make probability judgments, even if
Hmm.
the universe is metaphysically necessary, basically.
Right.
And so
Okay. Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
if you want to
And you
piggyback
gave the
off of that,
example. Yeah, and you gave the example of
the
writing on the
moon.
moon. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so I think that shows that. So, like, let's suppose that the universe is necessary, and the determinism is true, so that the precise way that the universe evolves is necessary. There's only one possible universe. This is a philosophical view that you might have. There are some arguments for it. Even given this, it looks like we can still reason about probabilities. That we can say that some piece of data supports one proposition over another, that it confirms some hypothesis, that it's evidence for some hypothesis. And so that suggests that there is some way to reason about probabilities in these kinds of scenarios. And I think the same is true with the case of um, the possibility that other universes are not possible.
All right, so I'm still putting all my questions into the live chat here, so it's gonna take just a second before I'm able to put it on the
Okay.
screen. But I can at least get this first one across to you. So this one is actually a super chat. So really appreciate that. Apostate. He says, does Dr. Climenhaga's account of probability make use of some principle of indifference? If so, how does he justify this use? And if not, how does this affect the fair coin toss example?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the
And
way that I
maybe go ahead
spelled
and
out,
explain what the principle of indifference is for
right,
anyone who
right.
might not know.
Yeah, yeah, I will do that. So the way that I explicated the account a minute ago is open on issues like whether we need to endorse the principle of indifference or some other principle of how the values of probabilities are determined. But once you have really any interpretation of probability, then there's going to be the question: where do the values of probabilities come from? What fixes the values of probabilities? And I do have some views about this. I don't have a firmly settled account because I think it is a very difficult question. But roughly speaking, my view is that there are some probabilities. This is going to be a somewhat long answer in response to this question, but I will get to indifference because I think it's a very complicated question, and the way in which people talk about indifference is often not clear in some of these respects. So my own view is that some probabilities are fundamental or basic, and then other probabilities are grounded in, are determined by, are dependent on the values of these basic probabilities. And these basic probabilities then, we then have the question: what determines their values? And that's where principles like the principle of indifference are going to be relevant. So the idea of the principle of indifference, there are different ways to state it, but the idea is something like: if B gives no reason to expect A over not A, or one alternative over another, then the probability of each of those alternatives is equal. And I think something like that principle is true. There are ways to state it in which it sounds tautologous. So one of the objections that people give to it is, oh, it doesn't actually what it gives out is only what's already put into it. So like if you understand, oh, it doesn't give a higher probability to one alternative than another, then they have the same probabilities. Um, I don't think that it's tautologous in that sense, in that I think there's a way of understanding it where um, it's something like it doesn't support one proposition over another, and then those probabilities are equal. And what goes into the antecedent of that condition then is something qualitative, something about um, support understood before we get into the mathematics. And then what comes out is this mathematical equivalence. So yeah, I do think that that's true in some cases. So in the coin case, for example, suppose that we know that the relevant physics and so on are such that this coin is the system doesn't support it landing heads over it landing tails. Then relative to that background, the probability of heads is equal to the probability of tails. Then there's a question of whether this is the only principle that's relevant to determining probabilities. There are going to be tricky cases where it's not clear if that can work, like if we're talking about the probabilities of metaphysically fundamental hypotheses. Well, those, there might not be any relevant background to them, and maybe we have to appeal to other considerations such as simplicity. Like maybe we think that a simpler hypothesis about the metaphysically fundamental parts of the world, that's going to be more likely than a more complex one. Those are difficult issues that I don't have a settled view on. But in response to the question, yes, I do think that indifference that there is some true principle of indifference that it will apply in some cases. And yeah, so that's what I have to say about that.
Okay. I just wanted to let everyone know that I have plenty of questions already lined up in the queue. So if you do want to make sure that your question gets in tonight, then you're going to have to do a super chat, basically, to sort of bump it up to the top here. But we do have plenty of questions in the live chat already so far.
Can I just add one more thing on that?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So one of the objections that people often make to the principle of indifference is that it leads to paradoxes when you apply it in different cases, that it leads to inconsistent results. And so that's part of what the distinction that I made between basic and non-basic probabilities is supposed to help with, that you should only apply the principle of indifference to basic probabilities. If you apply it unrestrictedly, then yes, you're going to get inconsistent results. So to say just a little bit more about my view on that, my view is that, roughly speaking, the probability of a proposition conditional on potential direct explanations of that proposition is a basic probability. And we start with those, and then we can use the mathematics of probability to get any other probability. And so if we look at the probability that the coin lands heads, given the causally antecedent information, so anything that's relevant to explaining why it lands heads or tails, then relative to that, if it doesn't support heads over tails, the probability will be 1/2. So that's an instance in which I think you can apply the principle of indifference. But then there are going to be other instances in which it would be a misapplication. If you were talking about some probability that is partly determined by that probability, like probability that it's a fair coin, given that it landed heads, for example. I think that's partly determined by the probability that it lands heads, given that it's a fair coin, rather than the other way around. And fair coin here means something like these background conditions are equally balanced between the two possibilities. There's a lot more to say there, but I think that it's relevant to mention those considerations as well.
All right, we'll try to keep these future questions a little bit on the shorter end. So this next one is from Indirish, I think. Is it possible that probability is not a computable function, that it's only possible to approximate?
So this gets into questions about the epistemology of probability and how we can know the values of probabilities. For probability, I guess it has to do with both the metaphysics and the epistemology. So to say that something is not computable is to say that there's no way of, this definition might not be exactly right, I'm not a mathematician, but roughly speaking, to say that there's no way of giving a finite, or not a finite, giving a description of it. Yeah, I guess it would be a finite description for specifying that number. So like the square root of 2, for example, that's not rational in that if you spell out the decimal expansion, then it's not equal to one integer over another, like 2/7 or whatever. But it is computable in that we have like a method for constructing that, so that for any number in that string of digits after the decimal, then we have a method that will let us eventually say what that number is if we just keep on going through that. But other numbers, um, are not like this. And a pi actually, even though it's getting a bit too much into mathematics maybe. So that's transcendental, but it's still computable. So we still have a method for like saying what each digit of pi is. Other numbers are not like this. Most real numbers are not like this. And you can't actually talk about specific ones, or it's difficult to do so because they're not like this. Whether the values of probabilities could be like this, at least in cases involving like finite hypothesis spaces, then it doesn't look to me like they can. It's not necessarily inconsistent with what I've said about the interpretation of probability that they could be, but it's hard to see why. Like the probability that the coin landing heads would be some uncomputable number, given the causally antecedent information. So I'm inclined to think that in those cases they can't be. In cases involving continuous probability spaces, like say that you have a continuous space and you want to know, you're like going to spin a spinner, what's the probability that it ends up like at a particular spot, given the causally antecedent information. That's maybe a little bit more difficult. So there, maybe you could construct cases where like if it's between 0 and some degree that is itself an uncomputable number, maybe the probability of that could be uncomputable. But I think it's only going to be in weird cases like that.
Gotcha. Well, let's move on to the next question. This one is from Gavin Herleman. What is the probability of the universe and human life created by a non-contingent being by a non-contingent being God than any other hypothesis? So what is the probability of the universe and human life created by a non-contingent being God than any other hypothesis?
So I'm not entirely sure that I understand the question, but let me say one question in the neighborhood, and you can tell me, Cameron, if you think I'm getting at the right idea here. So if we're looking at potential explanations of fine-tuning or of the data in general that we observe in the universe, well, there are going to be there's not only naturalism versus, say, classical theism, but there's also going to be a number of different ways of spelling out supernaturalist theories. Like you might have a classical omni-god that's omnipotent, omniscient, and all good, but you might also have like a god that is that doesn't have all of these traditional attributes to a maximal degree, that isn't all-powerful, for example. And then, we can ask about the probability of those different potential explanations. And in general, when we're reasoning probabilistically, we want to look at all of the possible hypotheses or all of the plausible hypotheses, as many as we can. So I think that is important to do in this as in other cases. But I don't have a whole lot more to say about how to go about doing that here.
Yeah, it sounds like what he or she is getting at is they just want to know like what is the probability of God over and above any other hypothesis there is. That seems like a pretty big question.
Well, so let me just say briefly about maybe relevant to this, but generally in how we're thinking about the probability of theism given fine-tuning or given all the evidence that we have. And this relates to the stuff I said earlier about basic and non-basic probabilities, how we compute the values of the non-basic ones. If we're talking about the probability of theism or single universe naturalism or multiverse naturalism or other possible explanations of fine-tuning, then there are going to be several factors which are relevant to this. So one is the probability of fine-tuning, by which I mean here the universe being life permitting, the probability of the universe being life permitting, given these different hypotheses. So we talked about the probability of that datum on single universe naturalism. It's also going to have some probability on the multiverse. It's going to have some probability on classical theism. And in general, whichever hypothesis makes that evidence most probable is going to be most strongly confirmed by that evidence. And the degree to which it's confirmed will be relative to how much more probable it makes that evidence than these other hypotheses. Then what's also going to be important is the prior probability of these different explanations. So if you think that, this is where I talked about simplicity, for example, is relevant to probability. If you think that theism is a particularly simple hypothesis, maybe it's more simple. Richard Swinburne argues this. It's more simple than these other supernaturalist theories on which God doesn't have these attributes to a maximal degree, then its prior probability might be higher than those. Or you might think that the probability of naturalism is higher, the prior probability is higher than theism because it only says that like one kind of thing exists, material things. Whatever you say about that, then those factors are both going to be relevant. What's the prior probability of these theories, and how strongly do they predict the evidence? How likely do they make fine-tuning, and so on for other evidences? And then you put those things together, and that's going to give you the probability on our total evidence, the posterior probability, and that's what Bayes' theorem does.
All right, so we have 3 more questions here, and we'll try to get through these as quick as we can. Hayden says, what roughly are the chances of the universe arising by strictly natural causes, if that's even possible?
So if I understand this question correctly, it has to do with the probability that there would be a universe at all. So we're not talking about a fine-tuned universe here, but the probability that a universe would exist at all given naturalism. I think that's a very difficult question. Roughly speaking, the way I would think about it is this. On that hypothesis, the universe is metaphysically fundamental. So there's no explanation of the universe in terms of a creator or a designer or anything like this. It's just ground level, the universe. And so the way that I would think about that would be something like, let's look at the hypothesis that the universe is fundamental, or I guess a universe, because we don't want to specify its qualities yet. We're going to bring that in later when we think about fine-tuning. What's the probability that a physical universe is fundamental compared to the probability that a God is fundamental? And they're most likely the relevant considerations, as I've said, are going to be things like simplicity. So how simple are these hypotheses? Do the different parts of the hypotheses, like I said, like omnipotence, omniscience, and so on, do those cohere together in a natural way, and so on? And so I don't have a precise value to give there. Again, I think it's a hard problem, how to think about these exact probabilities, but those are the kinds of considerations that I think are going to be relevant to answering that question.
All right, next one, we have 2 more questions. This one's from Richard Howard. He says, what role does probability play in the resurrection? Does the fact that most people who die stay dead mean that that the prior probability of the resurrection is extremely low?
Yeah, so here, I think this is a good occasion to talk about the relevance of conditional probabilities again. So it's going to depend very much on what the relevant conditions are, the probability of the resurrection. So what we're ultimately concerned with, if we're wondering, did the resurrection occur, is what's its probability on our total evidence. And one of the factors that's going to be relevant to that is, what is the prior probability that Jesus would be raised from the dead, given the causally antecedent factors, before we have like the evidence of the New Testament and anything else that's causally downstream from the resurrection either occurring or not occurring. And there, I think that's going to be dependent on the probability of potential explanations of the resurrection, or of the resurrection not occurring, and how probable those make the resurrection. So of particular relevance here, of course, is going to be theism. And so it'll be a question of what's the prior probability of theism, and then how probable does theism make the resurrection, and then how probable is the resurrection otherwise. If we suppose that the resurrection just couldn't happen naturalistically, that its probability is 0, then it's just going to be a question of what's the prior probability of theism and how likely does that make the resurrection. And for that, then, the fact that most people stay dead, well, it's not just going to be something where you can just say, oh, the frequency with which people have been raised from the dead is 0 or is very low, and so the probability of the resurrection is very low. That would be that might fall out of a certain kind of frequentism, but as we've talked about, I don't think that that's tenable. Instead, what you're going to look at is how likely is it that God would raise Jesus from the dead, and that might be different from the probability that God would raise somebody else from the dead. So the fact that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, that he predicted his resurrection, that he preached a message that God might want to validate, and so on, those are all relevant to that. And so I don't think that the probability before the resurrection occurred that it would occur is necessarily very high, but I do think that it's going to be higher than just looking at the frequency with which people have been raised from the dead or something, because it is at least imaginable, it's somewhat plausible, that God would want to vindicate Jesus' message in this way. He's more likely to be raised from the dead by God than just some random person who doesn't have any kind of religious or theological significance.
Yeah, and by the way, if you guys want to get a little bit more on prior probability of the resurrection, I did a 2-part series on our podcast with Dr. Callum Miller. So check out our podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, anywhere you get your podcast. You can check out our 2-part series where we looked at a little bit more in depth in the prior probability of the resurrection. We talked about objections like this, the fact that most people stay dead. We also talked about frequentism and Bayesianism and the contrast there between the two. All right, well, let's get on to the last question. This one's from Maverick Christian. He says, what's the best way, and this is going to, you guys are going to nerd out here on this, I'm sure. He's actually, Maverick Christian is going to be joining me in my response to Apologia on Thursday night, coming up in a few days here if you're watching this live. And he's going to be joining me. He wrote a blog post in response to Apologia's response, and so he'll be here with me. And he's obviously super, super intelligent. But here's the question that he asked, and so you'll understand after I read it out here. He says, what's the best way to map plausibility to probability? Cox's theorem or something else?
Yeah, so I like Cox's theorem. Yeah, so that's a pretty in-the-weeds question. A
good one to end out the stream on.
Yeah, so relevant to the background of that question, I mentioned at the beginning, you have these mathematical axioms of probability, and then there's this question, how well do these do in formalizing our pre-theoretic understanding of probability? And there are different arguments that philosophers and others have given for why the probability axioms of Kolmogorov are the right way to formalize probability, or why they give at least the right mathematical results. There's even more in the weeds questions about whether these are the fundamental mathematical rules, but at least give the right results. And I like Cox's theorem. So Cox's theorem is due to a mid-20th century mathematician R.T. Cox, I believe. I like E.T. James's presentation in his book, Probability Theory, The Logic of Science, chapters 1 and 2. And the basic idea there is that we have, they lay down some conditions on what, they use plausibility, that's their pre-theoretic name for the pre-theoretic notion. They lay down some conditions for what the plausibility of A given B, what principles or rules that should meet, and then they show that the mathematical axioms of Kolmogorov uniquely satisfy those principles. And I think that's a pretty good way of arguing.
All right, well, let's end it there. So is there anything that you'd like to leave with the audience, maybe someplace where they can go to find out more of your work? Obviously, I've already put everything in the description of the video, but anything you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, so in terms of learning more about probability, I'd recommend the Stanford Encyclopedia article that we mentioned. My Aeon article is a very short introduction to some different interpretations and explains why I like my interpretation, the degree of support interpretation. I also have, for those who want to get more into the more technical philosophy, I have some published work in philosophy journals. So most recently, The Structure of Epistemic Probabilities in Philosophical Studies, and that goes into more detail about my views on basic and non-basic probabilities, talks a little bit about the principle of indifference, how it combines with those. So that would be the place to go if you want to learn more about those things.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Nevin. This has been
all right.
Been awesome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Cool. And if you guys want to learn more about Capturing Christianity, head over to the website, capturingchristianity.com. Find out more about what we're doing there. Also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as well. I think we just surpassed 2,000 followers recently on Instagram. So I don't post all the time there, but I do try to keep it up to date as often as I can. But thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you later. All right.